The title of Arthur gave me is Progress in Neurophilosophy. So what has, since 10 years or 15 years, what has progress has occurred in neurophilosophy? And here's a picture. So the bad news is this is the last picture you're going to get. But it's actually a nice picture because it's a picture of a brain composed of a map. And I thought in some sense that might symbolize something. So if we think about progress, so again, there's, from boot camp before, from the initial meeting in 2002 that kind of set the field of neuroethics going. And as Martha and her colleagues and many of you have, as we know, there has been extraordinary progress in neuroscience. I mean, from the decade of the brain from the 90s and now, just everything that we're interested in, the reason that we're here, and the previous speaker, of incredible work in neuroscience in understanding these mental operations. Similarly, it's been very good set of years for neuroethics. So if you go back 10 years, we've had the start of journals, professional conferences, major grants, huge billion-dollar international brain projects, all of which have helped those of us who are working in neuroethics. But neurophilosophy is a bit trickier. So I'm kind of interested in that part. What is neurophilosophy? How has that progressed? So neuroethics, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, is the ethical implications of neuroscience and the neuroscience of moral judgment. So most of the work in neuroethics is focused on that. So neurophilosophy, and the terms I think coined by Patricia Churchland in her book, Neurophilosophy, which is a slightly different thing, which is a neuroscientific approach to the philosophy of mind. So the neurophilosophy, the philosophy of mind, as it's part of a kind of standard canonical philosophy program, looks at these types of issues. So since the dawn of time, we've been interested in the relationship of the mind to the brain. We've been interested in what's related mental causation. How does my idea of a beer lead me to go to the fridge? Content. Why are my thoughts about beer as opposed to something else? What defines the content of a psychological state? Consciousness, what has been famously called the hard problem. How does consciousness occur in the world? How is consciousness realized in the brain? Free will. How is it that we are voluntary agents? Maybe we're not. Maybe the view is that we are not. We're simply, as many like Daniel Wendell have argued, we are not free. It's an illusion. And then phenomenology and subjectivity. Can science, in a sense, explain not just the kind of neurobasis of what it's like to taste chocolate ice cream, but what it feels like to taste? The phenomenology, the quality of the experience, and subjectivity, which is each of us looks at the world from a unique perspective. We each have our own lives, a kind of self-subjective I. So this is what neurophilosophers talk about. So if you cut your cloth accordingly, what we're interested in is what has neuroscience told us about these things. So as before, it's been very good for neuroethics. I mean, all those looking at the moral, legal implications. It's generated enormous discussion. But how has neurophilosophy and neuroscience progressed over the last few years? So in many cases, it's been fascinating. So as you, again, I'm repeating, I'm sure what you know already, but if you look in terms of notion of mental causation, what is causing my ideas? And it relates, of course, mental causation to notions of autonomy and agency. So there's been considerable discussion in the neuroethics literature, journals like Neuroethics, Age of Neuroscience, Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, Philosophy and Technology, Bioethics have all published papers about how deep brain stimulation, how brain-computer interfaces raise questions about mental causation. So, for example, somebody whose seizures or whatever is caused by a machine that stops them, do they feel in control? You know, the phenomenological discussions about this, some people with BCI devices say, look, I feel empowered. Others say, look, I don't really feel as I'm in control. So this notion of mental causation, what's causing ideas? And then slightly more down the road, if you think of what's being discussed like implantable brain chips, again, is that a memory I'm having if I remember your face? Or was it just an informational state that was put into my brain? So there's been considerable discussion about mental causation with DBS and BCI. Again, if you look at the literature in neuroethics, people like Joseph Fins have written a lot about the minimally conscious state. So the work to detect the individuals who've been diagnosed as being with severe coma or vegetative state, research suggesting that in fact they may be far more aware than what we think through the use of brain-machine neuroimaging. And then perhaps a cottage industry over the last 10 to 15 years has been in free will. So all of the discussions about what the brain does, the neural correlate for this. If you look at just do a literature search within the neuroethics literature, free will has been a huge topic. So as Stephen Morse has talked about, there's been considerable discussion about the impact that neuroscience will have on the law. And the gloss is it's going to have a huge impact by some people because it's going to show that we're really not in control of our actions. So these seem to be areas where neurophilosophy has benefited by discussions raised by advances in neuroscience. So we have, relatedly, the notion of mental content. We have neuroimaging, so all the discussions about lie detection that have occurred in the literature. So if we hook up somebody to an MRI, can we reveal what you're thinking? So there are people who've written about this, people who talk about cognitive liberty, the freedom to have access to your own thoughts, whether, you know, the Fifth Amendment prevents people hooking you up and finding out what you think about. And then in terms of phenomenology, and again, subjectivity, what brain-machine interfaces have revealed about our notions of being an agent, of what we're perceiving, of what we're feeling. But the challenge, you know, it's kind of heretical to say in this room in front of this audience, but one of the limits for neurophilosophy is it's a particular colour or theme or way of thinking about the relationship between mind and body. So broadly speaking, very, very broadly speaking, there are those, and I'm, with apologies to my philosophy colleagues using these terms loosely, but who adopt what's called a reductionist view. So here we're looking to explain those mental concepts in terms of neural states. So we understand action and volitional control, phenomenal consciousness, judgment and decision making. What they really are neural states. Cynically, love is just a bunch of chemicals. But much of the history of philosophy and much of continued work in philosophy is resistant to that, which sees the mind and the mental as fundamentally autonomous. So, in one sense, this has perhaps limited the progress of neuroscience and its influence on philosophy, because neurophilosophy is by no means, you know, the official doctrine. So I just briefly, because Martha's already told me, I just want to focus on two areas that interest me that I think are very rich for the interface of neurophilosophy and neuroscience. So Joshua Green has done a lot of work on the neuroscience of moral judgment. And his view, and I go through this very quickly, is that why it's so interesting for philosophers is because his work suggests that the way we make moral judgments is in fact hardwired. Particularly our distinction between what we call consequentialist judgments and non-consequential judgments. So he has this dual process view, so the deontological judgment, if you make judgments based on duty. Consequentialist judgments, you make judgments based on consequences. So to his great interest and surprise, whereas the tradition in philosophy says that deontological judgments are rationalistic, consequentialist judgments are emotional, Green found the reverse is true. So, in a way, this is right at the very heart of philosophy, because he's saying, look, our philosophical moral judgments, the way we think about morality, there are interesting neuroscientific theories, evidence that suggests that we've got it wrong. So there's this case, very briefly, you can hit a switch that will turn a runaway trolley away from 5 people, or you can push somebody off a footbridge. The standard response in the literature is we're prepared to switch to save 5 rather than 1. We're less likely to push somebody off a footbridge. Why is that? Green says it's because pushing somebody requires a greater moral intervention. So one of the things he says is, look, proximity is what we're responding to. And our moral judgments shouldn't be based on proximity. It really shouldn't matter morally, in one sense, what my reaction is to the present situation, whether the person is in pain, is next door or 10,000 miles away. So Green says, look, it turns out our moral judgments are based on proximity. Should they be? Green says, no. Well, that's a fundamentally interesting philosophical question. And there's lots of people, for those who are particularly interested in the ethics of care or relational notions of morality, would disagree and say, no, morality should take into account proximity. So lastly, the thing that interests me particularly, there's been lots of debate about the translation of thought into action. So that's almost a slogan of what a BCI does. Sorry, that's the, get rid of that. So to kind of show you that if you just read that, so when you read that, the question is Ichiro an autonomous agent? Okay, so think about that one, and now think about that one. So kind of spoil the suspense and I'm so thrilled. So this is a standard paradigm example in philosophy of action that illustrates what's called the problem of causal deviance. And the problem goes like this. Look, even though Ichiro's bodily movements are caused by his beliefs and desires, there's reason to think that he's not the agent. I mean, so people who think and write about causation look at this and say, well, wait a minute. Bodily movement caused by beliefs and desires isn't sufficient for agency. But if that's the case, then we really should draw the same conclusion here in very broad terms. And if that's true, then, well, BCIs represent a kind of, are they agents? Are they different forms of agents? And there's very interesting stuff going on about this. So this first part, a distinction between basic and non-basic actions. Generally, moving your arm is something you can just do. Building a fire is something that you have to work on. So are BCI movements what we call non-basic actions, whereas normally they're basic? Is there a difference between intention and imagination? So normally, if I can move my arm by intending to move it. Somebody who moves through the use of BCI generally has to imagine the movement. But what work are those two terms doing here? I mean, does that say, we can say, oh yeah, that's not action because she imagined the movement but not intended it. It's also leading us to think about what counts as a theory of action. Sorry, what makes a viable theory of action? Should we be concerned with causality? And then finally, in the normal case of action, all of us, when we move, we get enormous amounts of sensory feedback. Some philosophers have said that a necessary condition of bodily movement, of agency, is bodily awareness, a kind of proprioceptive response. Well, if that's the case, I mean, although there's been substantial progress in the development of BCI technology, there's limited progress in providing individuals with sensory feedback. So what impact does that have on our theory of agency? Thank you.